Did you know that there are two kinds of nirvana in early Buddhism? We'll discuss those two coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute. That's onlinedharma.org, where you can find courses about early Buddhist Dharma and early Buddhism in general. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, this idea of nirvana, of two kinds of nirvana, it's something that we are not ordinarily aware of. We think of nirvana as being something nice that we can achieve someday, but not that there's two kinds of them. So, what is the difference? I think the best way to get at this difference is through a somewhat circuitous route, but one that, trust me, is going to help to explain everything. And that is a route through the notion of nirvana that we find in the Third Noble Truth. The Third Noble Truth is this truth of the attainment of nirvana, that this attainment is possible. And the way to understand that best is to look to the first and second Noble Truths that illuminate how this nirvana comes about. To refresh our memories, the first Noble Truth is the truth that life is unsatisfactory in some sense, that life is dukkha. Dukkha is often translated as suffering. Now, we may not quite understand that because we'll say to ourselves, well, life isn't suffering. We have very pleasant aspects to our lives too. But the point of the First Noble Truth is not to say that literally every moment of our lives is suffering, but that rather that even the good parts of our lives will come to an end. That even the good parts of our lives are, in a sense, not satisfactory. They're not the sorts of things that provide a secure, lasting refuge, because all things will pass. The Buddhist, I think it's important to look at the actual definition that the Buddha gives of dukkha, of suffering, when he discusses it in his purported first sermon. He says, birth is suffering, old age is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering, association with the disliked is suffering, separation from the liked is suffering, not getting what you wish for is suffering. And we'll come back to this very interesting definition later on in this video in a couple minutes, because it will help illuminate some of the issues behind why there are, I think, two different forms of nirvana in early Buddhism. But for now, let's turn to the second Noble Truth. The second Noble Truth tells us that this suffering exists because of a cause. There is a cause of this suffering. The cause of the suffering is craving, that we crave things to be a certain way. We may think of this as that when we come up with in our lives things that are unpleasant or painful, we crave for them to go away. And, on the other hand, when we have aspects of our lives that are pleasant, we crave for them to stay with us, for them not to go away, for them to remain. And this craving that we can feel if we sit in meditation for a time, we can introspect and really feel this kind of craving of wanting to maintain what we like and kick out what we don't. This craving is itself a form of suffering. It's unpleasant. It's a form of not wanting things to either change or be or not wanting things to remain, but it is a kind of an emotional tenseness, an emotional stress that remains within us. And that is partly what is suffering itself, is the craving also, which brings us to the third Noble Truth. And the third Noble Truth is that there is an end to this craving. This end to this craving is, if the craving ends, then the effect of that craving as well will end, which is dukkha, which is this suffering or unsatisfactoriness. And so we may wonder, if the end of this craving brings an end to suffering, then does the Buddha suffer? Does the Buddha feel pain? And I did an earlier video on that subject. I'll put a link to that video down below in case you want to see a more lengthy discussion about that issue. But for now, let's just keep that question in the back of our minds. We can see that some of the things that the Buddha discussed in his definition of dukkha definitely do involve craving, wanting things to be other than they are, or wanting things to remain the way they are. All of these aspects of dukkha, of unsatisfactoriness, are clearly involved with craving. But there are also some of the parts of the definition of dukkha that don't clearly and obviously involve craving. For instance, old age, sickness, and death. Now, old age, sickness, and death come upon us whether or not we have craving. We might say, well, even if I don't have craving, I'm still going to experience old age, illness, and death. Now, in a different sutta called the sutta on the two arrows, it's a simile of two arrows, a very famous early sutta, the Buddha discusses the way that an enlightened person and an ordinary person will experience a pain differently. That the enlightened person will experience the pain, but will let it go. They will not be craving for it to be otherwise. They may prefer it to be otherwise, but there's no craving involved. There's no emotional attachment involved. Whereas the ordinary person, when beset by a pain, say stuck with an arrow or stub your toe, the ordinary person is going to spend time lamenting that, is going to spend time in sort of a mental turmoil about that. And that lamentation, that mental turmoil, is itself a form of craving. I should say, is itself a form of pain, of suffering, as well as being a form of craving. And as a form of suffering, it actually redoubles the suffering. So the unenlightened person has to experience double the suffering. They experience the original pain, but also the admixture of this mental pain. But still in all, then, we might say, doesn't an enlightened person feel pain? And the answer is yes, they do. They feel pain. But then we might say, it doesn't seem as though there's a real end to dukkha, to suffering, with nirvana, because even if you attain nirvana, you still feel pain. And here's where we come to the two forms of nirvana in early Buddhism. I said this is going to be a sort of a roundabout way to get here, but I think it's necessary to have that background to really understand what the difference is here. And I'll go through these two forms one after the other. The first form is known as nirvana with remainder. There's different translations of it, but that's one that I particularly like, nirvana with remainder, or with residue left. And this is defined as, it says, here a bhikkhu, that is a monk, or a person anyhow, here a person is enlightened, however his five sense faculties remain unimpaired, by which he still experiences what is agreeable and disagreeable, and feels pleasure and pain. It's the extinction of attachment, hate, and delusion in him that is called nirvana with remainder. In a nutshell, this form of nirvana involves the ending of greed, hatred, and delusion, or attachment, hatred, and delusion. It involves the ending of these three, which ends our attachment, our emotional attachment, because we don't have greed towards them, we don't have hatred towards them, we don't want to push them away, and we don't have an ignorance about where they come from and how to get rid of them, so to speak. So, having ended all of that, we're in this position where we do feel pain, we feel pleasurable and unpleasurable experiences. However, we're not beset by any kind of mental turmoil over them. And this is the form of nirvana that persists in our lives. Now, the second form of nirvana in early Buddhism, some of us may be familiar with as something called parinirvana, or ultimate nirvana. This is what happens when an enlightened person dies. And in the early texts, we see this definition here. Here, a bhikkhu, a person, a monastic, is enlightened. For him, here in this very life, all that is experienced not being delighted in will be extinguished. That, monastics, is called nirvana without remainder. Traditionally, it's understood that after this life, we are reborn into the next life because of a subtle greed, desire, or even aversion to life in general. That will cause us to be reborn on a traditional understanding. And so that birth will bring in its wake old age, sickness, and death. If, however, we are able to get ourselves out of this round of rebirth, out of samsara, if you like, through enlightenment, on a traditional understanding, we therefore get ourselves out of any future experience of these unpleasant states. We get ourselves out of having to experience old age, illness, and death. And in that way, parinirvana really is an extinction of all of what is dukkha. All of what is dukkha goes away. All of what is unpleasant, I should say, all of what is painful, all of what is suffering, all of what is unsatisfactory is extinguished finally on parinirvana, on the achievement of parinirvana. Now, from a, shall we say, modern or more secular perspective, we might set aside the issue of rebirth. For some of us, that's more what we find important. And what we find important really is more of a this life practice. And in that case, what we'll really be focused upon is the ideal of nirvana with remainder, with the understanding that a life that is lived without attachment, without greed, without hatred, and without ignorance is the best sort of life that we can hope to live, and that is the true ideal that we can have. Now, there are also other questions that may arise over the attainment of nirvana in general, and I did a video a long time ago about a couple of different questions that at least had come up to me and that I've heard other people have, and I'll leave a link to that video up here in case you want to hear a couple of more questions about nirvana. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please consider taking a look at my Patreon page and joining us. Well, we'd love to have you, and there's lots of interesting things to check out over there. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video.